Barrindale was the kind of place where people left their doors unlocked at night, where the biggest scandal was a missing sheep or a power outage during footy night. Surrounded by the vast emptiness of the Australian outback, it felt cut off from the world, a quiet town nestled among dry hills, red dust, and gum trees that rattled in the wind. Tourists rarely came through, and the locals liked it that way. Life moved slow, and the silence of the land became part of the people. But that peace shattered one Sunday morning when a hiker named Dave Murren, out for a walk with his dog near the old Bickley cattle station, stumbled upon something strange. His dog had stopped, sniffed the ground aggressively, and started digging. Curious, Dave followed. What he uncovered first was a piece of canvas, dirty, weather-worn, but unmistakably man-made. Then came the smell. Earth, rot, and something he couldn't name. He pulled back the fabric, and what stared back at him was a decayed human arm, bent unnaturally, with dried skin clinging to bone. The authorities arrived by afternoon. Dave was shaken, sitting in the back of an ambulance with a thermal blanket over his shoulders. Forensics marked the area, and by sunset, they found something even more disturbing. A second grave, just 30 meters away, almost identical. Same canvas wrap. Same shallow burial. The bodies had clearly been there for months, maybe longer. There were no signs of animals disturbing the graves, no visible wounds, and strangely, no shoes on either of the victims. Only bare, blackened feet poking from the fabric. News spread fast in Barrindale. By Monday, every household had heard the same phrase whispered in fear: 2 bodies, no answers. The town's only grocery store was filled with nervous chatter. Parents stopped letting their kids wander. Doors were locked for the first time in decades. The town's single police station, usually quiet and underused, was suddenly overwhelmed. Everyone wanted to know who the dead were, and more importantly, who had put them there. No one could believe it at first. Murder. In Barrindale. It didn't make sense. There were no strangers passing through. No one had gone missing. People started checking on neighbors, calling distant relatives, and some even reported strange dreams or bad feelings they had ignored. Rumors floated. Some said it was drug traffickers, others feared it was cult activity. A few blamed drifters, even though none had been seen in the area for months. The detectives brought in from the city didn't have much to go on. The canvas was too generic to trace. The soil had preserved little DNA. Even dental records yielded no matches. Whoever these people were, they hadn't existed in any system. And whoever had buried them hadn't wanted them to be found. But one detail stuck with the forensics team. On each grave, almost hidden under the topsoil, was a small stack of 3 stones. Not just tossed there, but carefully arranged. Like a marker. Or a calling card. That's when they knew this wasn't just a single act of violence. This was the beginning of something darker. Weeks passed, but the fear in Barrindale only grew deeper. As police combed the surrounding land, more discoveries came, gruesome, silent confirmations that the killer hadn't just struck once. 2 more shallow graves were uncovered near an abandoned railway line, then another near the dried creek bed southeast of town. That made 6 in total. 6 lives lost, each buried with the same quiet method. Wrapped in canvas, barefoot, and marked with 3 small stones stacked neatly on top of disturbed earth. By now, it was clear these weren't isolated incidents. A pattern was forming, though it made little sense. The victims didn't match. One was a woman in her 20s, another a man estimated to be in his 60s. There were no obvious connections, no similar backgrounds, no shared professions or travel history. It wasn't a spree. It wasn't even a crime of passion. It was calculated, deliberate. The killer had a plan, even if the investigators couldn't see it yet. Media vans started lining up outside the town's entrance. Journalists from Sydney and Melbourne arrived, pushing microphones in locals' faces, asking questions no one could answer. The nickname, the Stoneman, came from a headline in a national paper. It stuck. People said it with a mix of fear and disbelief. A serial killer, here, in Barrindale. It didn't feel real. But with each new grave unearthed, the name began to feel less like a newspaper creation and more like a curse echoing through the dry bushland. Detectives mapped the burial sites on a satellite image. What they found unsettled them even more. The graves formed a loose ring, spread out over nearly 20 kilometers, but always within a day's walk from the heart of Barrindale. It suggested someone local. Someone who knew the land intimately, where to dig, how to hide, and how to avoid every camera, witness, and patrol. This wasn't an outsider passing through. This was someone who belonged. More resources were pulled in. A forensic anthropologist, 2 behavioral profilers, and even a specialist in ritualistic crime flew in from the city. They studied every detail. The way the canvas was folded, the placement of the stones, the absence of shoes. They debated meanings. Was it symbolic? Was the killer targeting specific traits or acting on a personal belief system? Some speculated that the 3 stones might represent something, perhaps a religious reference or a twisted memorial gesture. But without a single survivor or witness, they were grasping in the dark. The town's fear turned inward. Suspicion began to rise among neighbors. Old feuds resurfaced. Some locals accused each other of being not right. Barrindale, once united in its quiet way of life, now felt fractured. People started leaving. Families packed up and drove off without saying goodbye. Houses were left empty, their windows boarded and gates swinging open in the wind. The land remained quiet, but the silence no longer brought peace. It brought dread, because the graves kept appearing, and no one could say who would be next. The investigation had reached a standstill. Weeks turned into months, and despite the growing number of victims, there were still no leads. Every grave uncovered told the same story, carefully prepared, deliberately hidden, marked with the same eerie signature of 3 stacked stones. The detectives were drowning in dead ends. DNA results turned up no matches. The victims had no missing person reports tied to them. Some had no fingerprints on record, no identification, nothing to tell the world who they were or where they had come from. It was as if they had simply vanished from thin air, then reappeared, lifeless and buried, in the unforgiving red dirt of the outback. With pressure mounting from both the public and national media, the lead detective, Sergeant Kerr, turned her attention to historical files. Maybe this wasn't new. Maybe this was old, long buried, and forgotten, just like the victims. She and her team began going through dusty archive boxes stored in the basement of the Barrindale police station, some untouched for decades. It was slow work. Most cases were minor, stolen tools, road accidents, a pub fight or 2, but then, tucked in a faded brown folder, they found something that stopped them cold. The folder was labeled simply, Unresolved Deaths, 1987. Inside were 3 case files from the same year. Each one described a decomposed body found in the outskirts of the same region, canvas-wrapped, shallow grave, no footwear. At the time, investigators had considered them accidental deaths or possibly suicides. But the similarities were unmistakable. The reports even included photos of the graves. And there, in grainy black and white, sat the familiar sight, 3 small stones stacked neatly atop each one. The original investigating officer had retired long ago, but at the bottom of the last report was a note scrawled in faded pen, *, he's not done yet. *. That single sentence chilled everyone in the room. It meant someone had seen the pattern back then, and for reasons unknown, nothing had been followed up. These killings weren't new. They had started nearly 4 decades ago, then stopped. Or so everyone thought. Now the team faced a troubling reality. The killer hadn't emerged from nowhere. He had simply gone quiet. For 25 years, there had been nothing. No graves, no whispers, no sign of activity. Had he been arrested for something else? Had he moved away? Or worse, had he never stopped, just changed how or where he buried his victims? They mapped the old graves with the new ones, and the overlap was undeniable. All were located within the same terrain, mostly along old bush tracks and forgotten routes used by cattle herders decades ago. It painted a disturbing image of someone who knew the land like it was an extension of their body. Someone who could kill, disappear into the scrub, and leave nothing behind but silence and stones. The worst part wasn't just that he had returned. It was that no one had noticed he was ever gone. With the link to the past now confirmed, the investigation changed direction. Detectives widened their scope, revisiting the 1987 files and cross-referencing them with every possible name associated with the area. Former suspects, landowners, military personnel, even survivalists. They combed through census data, looked into land title histories, and spoke with retired officers who barely remembered the original cases. The focus became narrow: find someone who had lived in Barrindale before, left or disappeared, and then quietly returned, or worse, never left at all. Among the locals who stepped forward to help, one man stood out. Harold Fenn was 62, soft-spoken, and well-liked around town. A retired bush guide, Harold knew every inch of the surrounding land and often volunteered when hikers went missing or tourists got stuck. He lived in a small weatherboard cottage on the edge of town with no close family and spent his days tending to his vegetable garden or walking his dog through the scrub. When police asked for help identifying old landmarks or searching satellite maps, Harold offered without hesitation. He marked likely burial spots on a map based on his knowledge of natural cover, soil softness, and past cattle trails. Strangely, 2 of the areas he highlighted resulted in new grave discoveries, both wrapped in canvas, both identical to the others. At first, police saw it as good fortune, or perhaps a lifetime of experience. But the coincidences kept piling up. Harold's guesses were too accurate, too specific. He not only guessed locations but even offered explanations for the stacked stones, saying it might be an old settler tradition or a way to keep spirits pinned down. Then came the canvas. One of the forensics techs made an unusual discovery. The material used to wrap the bodies wasn't typical modern tarp. It was military-grade canvas from post-war surplus kits, used mainly in the 1950s and 60s. Only a limited number had ever been distributed in that region. Tracing the shipments led back to a local veteran, Harold's father, who had received several rolls of it decades ago after returning from service. One roll was never accounted for. Still, it wasn't enough to accuse him outright. There was no direct evidence, no DNA, no fingerprints, nothing that legally tied Harold to the crimes. The detectives decided to monitor him quietly. They installed a tracker on his truck and waited. A week later, the signal led them deep into the bush, far from any beaten trail. Hidden beneath layers of fallen branches and red dust, they found Harold alone with a shovel, covered in sweat, and standing beside a half-dug hole. Nearby sat a wrapped object, canvas stained dark with moisture. Police moved in fast and arrested him without a word exchanged. Inside Harold's home, what they uncovered turned suspicion into horror. Detailed maps of the region with red circles, a stack of journals dating back to the 1970s, and dozens of small, numbered stones lined neatly on a shelf like trophies. It was no longer just theory. The Stoneman had a name. Harold Fenn sat silently in the interrogation room for nearly 9 hours. He never asked for a lawyer, never protested, never cried. He simply stared at the table in front of him as though he were waiting for something to begin. But when investigators confronted him with the maps, journals, and the newly uncovered body in the bush, he finally spoke, just once. "They all deserved it," he said, before going quiet again. He refused to explain further. No more words came from him after that. The journals filled in the missing pieces. They were meticulously kept, with entries written in precise, neat handwriting. Each one described a victim. Some entries were short, just a date, a location, a brief comment like drifter, selfish, or wasteful with water. Others were long and detailed, describing how Harold had observed them, followed them, and judged them. He called them blights. He wrote about cleansing the land, about restoring balance, about removing greed, arrogance, and decay. It was clear that Harold didn't see himself as a killer. He saw himself as a caretaker. The chilling part wasn't just the method, it was the scale. The journals documented murders stretching back to 1979, far earlier than the oldest known cases. The gaps between kills weren't pauses, as detectives had hoped, but blind spots, years where victims had simply never been found. In some cases, Harold had buried them so deep or far off track that even he wrote "no return to site" beside the location, indicating he couldn't find the graves again. He wasn't killing for rage or money. He killed because he believed it was necessary. A duty. With his notes and maps, police uncovered 9 more burial sites, all matching the same ritualistic style. That brought the official count to 31. But as forensic teams continued to search, they found hints of even more: empty grave markings in his journals, stones numbered into the 40s. It was likely that several bodies had decomposed fully or been disturbed by animals over time, making recovery impossible. Still, Harold never confessed to an exact number. He just smiled when asked. During the trial, which became the most followed in Australian legal history, Harold remained calm and unreadable. He showed no emotion, even as the families of victims filled the courtroom. He didn't argue with the charges. He didn't deny a single count. In the end, the judge declared him the most prolific serial killer the country had ever seen and sentenced him to life in a high-security facility. He didn't flinch. But one detail from the journals left investigators shaken. Near the back of the final book was an entry dated just weeks before his arrest. It read, *, she moved. I didn't bury her deep enough. She watches me now. The others are quiet, but she stares. *. No missing persons matched the description he gave. No body was ever found in the area he marked. Some believe it was guilt creeping into his mind. Others believe it was a mistake, one victim who wasn't quite dead. The case was closed. But the bush never stopped whispering.